Good morning. The first reading is from the first chapter of Ezra, verses 1 to 11, and may be found on page 366 in the Pew Bibles. End of the Babylonian captivity. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also in a written edict declared, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem in Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let all survivors, in whatever place they reside, be assisted by the people of their place with silver and gold, with goods and with animals, besides free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem." The heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred, got ready to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. All their neighbors aided them with silver vessels, with gold, with goods, with animals, and with valuable gifts, besides all that was freely offered. King Cyrus himself brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. King Cyrus of Persia had them released into the charge of Mithridath the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar the prince of Judah. And this was the inventory: gold basins 30, silver basins 1,000, knives 29, gold bowls 30, other silver bowls 410, other vessels 1,000. The total of the gold and silver vessels was 5,400. All these Sheshbazzar brought up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thanks so much, Karen, for that reading from the first chapter of Ezra. Wasn't that something, that inventory of everything that was provided and sent back with the people? Our second reading comes from Psalm 137, a very famous psalm singing of the pain of the exile. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts together be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One thing I noticed after I prepared my sermon was there was no joke in there, and there was no humor in it. So I thought, well, that's a good summer joke. So I Googled a couple for you, so indulge me here. Thought with my friend Ian up there, what do you call 6 weeks of rain in Scotland? Summer. And like what I have, how do you prevent a summer cold? Catch it in the winter. Okay. What do you call a French guy in sandals? Philippe Philop. What did the pig say at the beach on a hot summer's day? I'm bacon. Okay, those had nothing to do with anything, just no extra charge. But it reminded me that when we had that little girl stay with us, she loved those little jokes that were on the popsicle sticks, you know. So that's from that kind of humor. Well, summer is a wonderful time of year, isn't it? Who didn't look forward to summer vacation growing up? Some of the best memories of childhood and when we raised our own kids were on summer vacation. And we made another wonderful summer memory this week when our daughter Debbie was in town for a meeting, and we were able to have dinner on a sidewalk restaurant in New York City with Mom, Dad, and our 2 kids. The summer is off to a great start here at PCMK. Will, Elizabeth, and I had an amazing week with 11 high school youth on our mission trip to West Virginia. And then within a few days after we got back, we had a nice visit with one of our missionaries we support. And meanwhile, then our long-awaited construction project has finally begun. And summer worship is also a nice change from the routine as well. We've had talented members of our church share their musical gifts, including my son today. And we've had guest organists and guest preachers. And our elders did an amazing job in leading worship on our annual Elder Sunday in June. And so today we begin a summer sermon series that's going to focus on a rather obscure part of the biblical story, but one that is really amazingly relevant. Each week will stand alone, but there'll also be a thread through all of these sermons that Will Cosnett and I will bring you between now and September. In past summers, I've asked you for requests on sermon topics in the summer, and we've looked at mostly Old Testament stories like David and Goliath and Noah's Ark and so on. Stories you learned about in Sunday school but have not thought about much as an adult. Well, this year I was drawn to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I started thinking about which books of the Bible we have not looked at recently, and there's quite a few on that list. We tend to focus on the Gospels and the New Testament letters of Paul on most Sundays, but there is so much rich literature in the 39 books of the Old Testament. And as I thought about the issues that are in the headlines today, I thought of Ezra and Nehemiah. So before we look into today's text from Ezra chapter 1, let me take a moment to set the context of these two books. Ezra and Nehemiah are tucked away in the middle of the Old Testament just after two other books that nobody reads, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and before two books that really get quite a bit more attention, Esther and Job. For much of their existence, they were known as just one book, Nehemiah, and it was in medieval times that they were separated into two books in both the Jewish and Christian tradition. Both books involve the history of the Hebrew people returning from exile in Babylon to rebuild Jerusalem. And in shorthand, Ezra is about rebuilding the temple, and Nehemiah is about rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. And right away, you can probably see some of the connections to the issues of today. Well, first of all, they're on a building campaign, as we are. But more importantly, the story touches on many contemporary issues like refugees and migration and walls and racism and restitution. And the story is set in familiar territory even, Persia and Babylon, which are today basically modern Iran and Iraq. Our story begins with the Hebrew people in exile in Babylon, where they had been for about 70 years. An entire lifetime had passed. Almost no one alive in Babylon could remember Jerusalem or its temple. But during the exile, they had told stories to keep alive their faith in Yahweh. The psalm we read today expresses the angst of being in exile and remembering Zion along the rivers of Babylon. The Hebrew people were a tight-knit group during the exile. They told stories and sang songs, even as they dreamed of going home. Sometimes we wonder why immigrant groups don't assimilate faster when they come to a new country. They stick together and isolate themselves, some would say. But it is certainly natural to come together when you are in a strange land and comfort each other with stories of home. Our country has seen waves of immigrants of various nationalities who come and for many generations live together in certain neighborhoods and dominate certain industries. New York was built with Irish, Italian, and other European immigrant communities. And like the Hebrews, they stuck together to help each other survive in a strange land. And they even wanted to worship in their own way. I love the story of how St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York was built by the Irish Catholics as a spiritual home for their community in the midst of a mostly Protestant city. Maybe they read Ezra and Nehemiah for inspiration. Well, back to our story. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, has long since died, and Cyrus the Great of Persia has now conquered and annexed Babylon. And he was impressed by this group of refugees and made a decree that they should return home to restore the temple and capital city, Jerusalem. It's almost like a reverse refugee story. They'd been taken from their homeland against their will, and now they're being encouraged and supported in their return. Now, I'm sure Cyrus had some strategic reason for sending the Hebrews back to Jerusalem. Perhaps he wanted an ally as a buffer between his empire and Egypt to the south. Perhaps he just wanted to get rid of this community from Babylon. But maybe, just maybe, he was impressed with what he saw in their culture and religion and wanted to curry favor with them and their God. Whatever the motivation, Cyrus sends them on their way and offers to support them in every way possible. Now you have to stop and wonder how many of them would really have wanted to go. As we noted, they would not have been, or they all would have, virtually all of them would have been born in Babylon. It was the only home they had known. Some would have had good jobs by now and maybe even accumulated wealth and status. Why would they want to leave and return to a land they had never known? We do not know how many left, but enough left to make it a real migration. We should also note that not everyone was sent to Babylon in the first place. Most scholars agree it was only the ruling class and the elites who were taken into exile in Babylon. There were many Hebrew cousins who had stayed behind in Jerusalem and the surrounding countryside, which will produce some interesting conflicts later, as you can imagine, as these elites return home. The text says that it was Cyrus who issued the decree, but it was God who stirred both Cyrus and the Hebrew people to get up and go. God's Spirit was at work in these historic circumstances. And what's most amazing to me in this first chapter of the story is the generosity of their neighbors, and even of Cyrus himself. The neighbors, it says, gave them gifts of silver and gold and animals for the journey. And then there's this incredibly detailed list of items that Cyrus returned to them that Nebuchadnezzar had taken as bounty. There were 30 gold basins and 1,000 silver basins and 29 knives. That's an odd one. 30 gold bowls and so on, with a total of, it says, 5,400 gold and silver vessels. Must have had a huge storage unit down at the public storage facility. Nebuchadnezzar had taken them as a ransom, and now they were being returned as restitution. That just doesn't happen in history, does it? Someone making restitution. But perhaps it should. The people make their journey back to Jerusalem, and the rest of the story involves the capital campaign to rebuild the temple and the walls and to restore the law of Moses over the land. But for today, let's stop right here and reflect on this dramatic gesture of public apology and restoration. Cyrus saw the evil of the exile and sought to make it right, and was willing to make some sacrifices for it. He could have considered those 500 gold and silver vessels part of his bounty of conquest, but he restored it to the people it had been taken from. As we said at the outset, this ancient story touches on some of the most important issues of our time. This example of restorative justice was unique to that time and place, but it does shed light on an issue that keeps coming up for us here in North America. In the United States and Canada, we know we did a great deal of harm to the indigenous people who were here before the arrival of Europeans. What would restorative justice look like there? In the United States, the legacy of slavery is so pervasive that some have called for reparations to African Americans for the evils done to their ancestors and their people. In a recent example, Georgetown University has been challenged to do something about the fact that it got its financial start through the sale of over 200 human beings as slaves. It's hard to know what to do with the big issues of injustice done so long ago. Sometimes people get sarcastic and cynical and say things like, so what should we do? All go back to Europe and give the Indians back their land? Well, of course not. Although Liberia was an interesting experiment of freed slaves returning to Africa. No, of course, we can't undo history and its consequences, but we can take responsibility. We can start with acknowledgement and apology. A few months ago, as I was preparing for our night with Paul Schrader at the Jacob Burns over his new movie, excuse me, his new movie, First Reformed, I watched the video of Paul's lecture about his movie and his book, Transcendence in Film, at the Toronto Film Festival late last year. While Paul said many interesting things in that video, I was struck by how the MC of the event began the proceedings. He began with an acknowledgement that they were gathered on the ancestral lands of the Mississauga and other First Nations people, and then just went on with the evening. I thought, what an amazing way to start the program, acknowledging they were gathered on the ancestral lands of the First Nations people. Well, it doesn't fix anything, an acknowledgement like that, but maybe it's a start. But before you think Canadians have treated the Indigenous people better than Americans have, you should read the headlines in Canada in recent years, which I've followed this story a little bit. There's been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission into the system of religious schools that many Native children were forced to attend from the 1920s right up until the late 1970s. The goal was to Christianize and ultimately integrate these children into mainstream society. The children were punished for speaking their native language and were taught that everything about their culture was pagan and evil. And there are stories of sexual and physical abuse as well. After years of documenting stories from survivors, the denominations involved, including the Presbyterian Church of Canada, apologized for their participation in this system, and the Canadian government set up a $2 billion restitution fund. Each surviving student would receive $10,000 and $3,000 for each year they spent in those schools. In this country, we have struggled to come to terms with the enormous evil of slavery. Just after the Civil War, the United States government announced a plan of restorative justice. Each former slave was to receive 40 acres of land and a mule to begin farming for themselves. Land along the coasts of South Carolina and Georgia was designated for this purpose under the direction of General William Sherman. But other forces soon took over, and the land was given over to other purposes, and the project never moved forward. 100 years later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would refer to General Sherman's promise as a check that came back insufficient funds. Well, God's promises never come back insufficient funds. The ancient Hebrews were restored to their native land along with gifts from their neighbors. And each of us here today can most likely point to some way that God has taken care of us. And so God calls on you and me to take care of our neighbors and those who have suffered injustice. We are part of God's plan of restorative justice. It begins with acknowledging when we have violated or offended another as individuals and as a society. And then the next step is good faith efforts to find ways to make it right. It may not involve money, but it certainly involves a willingness to make any sacrifice that will restore justice where there has been injustice. If Cyrus, the ruthless conqueror of ancient Persia, can be generous and make restitution, certainly you and I can be ambassadors of restorative justice in our daily lives. And maybe, just maybe, we can help our nation live up to what Dr. King then called for. Instead of 40 acres and a mule, he demanded a check that will give former slaves, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Making restitution. Think about it. Maybe there's someone in your personal life you need to make restitution with. And then again, maybe not. but we can all be part of making restitution as a society for those who have been wronged. I've been pleased at the almost unanimous outrage there has been as a society at the sight of children being separated from their parents at the border. And the most obvious restitution is to reunite these families. Ezra and Nehemiah. I bet you didn't see all these contemporary issues coming from such an obscure ancient book. But I think you can see that these two books should be on any summer reading list. So let's read them together. Amen.